I'm BJ Swain, and I want to say thank you for checking out this panel discussion on a familiar spirit conjured by a magical group operating in Baltimore, Maryland. If you enjoy this content, please like, follow, and share. Familiar spirits are obviously a popular topic in magic. The idea has captured the attention of contemporary magicians in most forms of magic. It's one of the most well-attested concepts that survives from historical magic. Recording this panel inspired me to write a new book that covers familiar spirits more extensively than any previous work. Familiar Unto Me, Witches, Sorcerers, and Their Spirit Companions is now available from Amazon and will be available from Barnes & Noble soon. Check out the notes under this video for the link. Along with familiars, conjuration of demons and spirit keeping are also popular topics. Today's panel discussion will hit on topics of interest for people interested in familiars, work with demons, and creating permanent spaces to house and work with spirits. William Blake Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis conjured a demon from the Book of the Offices of Spirits for the 25th anniversary celebration of the Lodge. We contracted a familiar spirit from the demon which was conjured. We saw a ton of benefits from our work with our demonic familiar, and so we decided to hold a celebration for the anniversary of its conjuration. It's not super common for OTO bodies to do that sort of magic. There were arguments for why it should be more common, as well as arguments for why it shouldn't be done at all. This panel discussion includes several of the former lodge officers involved and a current lodge officer discussing their experiences with setting up the familiar, working with it, and the sabbat which was held to celebrate it. There was a lot of interest in this work, so people provided us with questions, and I collected those from social media where people posted them, and our panelists attempted to answer them. If you enjoy this discussion, and I hope you do, please like, follow, and share, and also follow Glory of the Stars on Facebook for more content like this.
So, broken down the questions kind of based on how they're grouped together. And the initial question that falls into sort of the category of why we went forward with setting up a familiar spirit for William Blake Lodge was, do OTO lodges typically have familiar spirits? I guess there's probably going to be people having different awareness of stuff they've heard about at different lodges. But does anyone want to kind of tackle that question first?
I can say very honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
I've never heard of them.
We might have, I don't think we could possibly be the only ones, but we're the only ones I know of.
I will say that no examples came up in the unconference segment on that, so there was at least nobody present at Noticon who was aware of any examples.
Or willing to admit it.
I think I've heard of one other body that has a familiar spirit.
Oh, cool.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, I've also heard about one. I think Rufus told me about being familiar with another body having one. I thought it was Cleveland, but I could be mistaken. I figured
That's the one I heard of too.
Yeah, and I know Rufus and Harper had asked at one point about the process because they thought it might be something that may interest people in the Minneapolis area, but I don't think that they went forward with anything along those lines.
I haven't heard of any of that, at least. But that does not prove that it isn't true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like the sort of thing where, with as individual as bodies can be, that a body could have done that, and it might just be something that's not really talked about, but also seems sort of outside of the general Aleister Crowley approach to things that a lot of bodies try to do. So I could see where not many would have.
That sounds right to me.
All right, so our next question is kind of a multi-part question. I guess we'll just start with the first part. Why did we decide to obtain a familiar spirit? And or I guess sort of going into the rest of the question, what gave us the idea that we needed to in the first place, and how do we conclude that this was the application of the appropriate force at the appropriate time? So I guess I should probably start with that, answering that question, since I was the one that kind of put together the idea initially. we were celebrating the lodge's 25th anniversary, not as a lodge, but just as existing. And I was asked to do kind of like a capstone ritual for the weekend of celebrations, and thought that it would be interesting to do a demon conjuration, because that's something that doesn't get done a lot at OTO bodies. And sometimes when it does, it's kind of a sort of stripped down psychological approach to the Gaiety of Solomon, as opposed to a more traditional medieval or Renaissance, early modern approach. And so I thought it'd be interesting to kind of explore that. And as I thought about that idea, it occurred to me that if we did something that tied in elements of the OTO system and elements of the EGC system to make it something that was kind of more specific to what we were doing. And I was inspired a little bit by Jake Stratton Kent's Goetic liturgy text towards that end, that might be something that was particularly fitting for the 25th anniversary celebration. And admittedly, I also thought it was something that could potentially shake things up a little bit, that it's the sort of magic that can be very visceral, especially since we would incorporate not just things related to the OTO system, but incorporate ancestor veneration and traditional means of demonic conjuration. And going through with something as materially visceral as binding a demonic familiar to a skull, that would be something that would be very outside of the box of what most people had experienced. And so it would not just present something that was new to people, but also something that forced them to kind of confront how they thought about magic and how they thought about the types of magic that were done at OTO bodies. And since it was going to be a large event with a large group of people, it seemed like the best place for something like that to happen, in my view. So I guess we've got a couple people who were officers at the time, including the lodge master at the time. Did any of you guys have any thoughts about when it was initially brought up that this is what we would be doing? Reactions or thoughts around that?
Speaking as the former body master, honestly, I just thought it was a good idea because Blake was dealing with some reduced membership, some reduced enthusiasm and attendance, and so having a spirit that might help things along seemed like a good idea. It seemed like we're magicians, we do magic towards an end, and an end of improving things for the lodge seemed like a valuable way to cap off the weekend.
And there was specific improvement that was sought, correct?
Yeah, we, at the time, we were kind of debating whether or not we wanted to keep the 24/7 space that we had, which was, I don't think it was the largest OTO body space anymore, but it had been the largest 24/7 OTO body space at one point, and was definitely still up there. And we were, because we had had a drop in membership because of some drama related to some former members of the lodge, there was discussion about whether or not it made sense to continue using funds to maintain that type of space, or if we should drop down to a smaller space and try to regroup and kind of figure out what was going to happen with William Blake, whether or not we were even going to maintain lodge status. And then, which was kind of ironic to be looking at as we were coming up on a big milestone anniversary. So when we contracted the familiar spirit, it was generally sort of charged to look after the interests of the lodge, but more specifically to help the lodge grow, to help create financial stability and financial growth for the lodge. And shortly after that, over the next couple months, we had a significant uptick in the number of members. I think we became a little more financially stable, and kind of questions about dropping down to event rentals for space or dropping down in status became questions that were no longer being discussed, as far as I'm aware. And I know we have one of our former facilities people on as well. Do you have any further insight into kind of what we were looking at or stopped looking at after that point?
I mean, I can certainly speak and say that that was a very difficult time. Stephanie had inherited a really tough situation. We were in a difficult location that wasn't as accessible as we might have liked. And there had been some, as you said, some issues with drama. There's some ongoing issues with drama. And some of the people who had previously, been very strong supporters had been drawn away by their own personal issues. So it was a tough situation, and we were, hauling out to Baltimore twice a month for 2 hours each way, and really pushing to make things work. And I felt like any help that we could get, we're magicians. Why are we not using magic to improve this situation? And this is a very efficient form of magic that works very well for creating change, and that was what we needed.
Right, well, unless anyone has anything else on kind of the topic of why we decided to go with that, or what impact it had, then I think we can move on to some questions about the ritual. So the first ritual question is about preparations that were used for the rituals and what material were used and how were they prepared. And again, this is one I probably need to answer the most.
Yep.
For this ritual, it actually involved several weeks of preparing some of the materials and going around to different places to collect materials. For those who aren't particularly familiar with what we had set up, we ultimately put together a jar that had in it consecrated dirt that was blended with herbs and incenses and blood, and then had iron spikes that were used to spike down names of particular demonic forces, encircling a skull that had a seal painted on it in kind of a blood-based paint, that also had some of the incenses and herbs soaked into it as well. And those were kind of the main material components that were at the center of the ritual. Obviously, there were other components like the sword, the incense that was used in the ritual, the lamens that were worn, things along those lines. But preparing the jar was kind of the big thing. And so for some of that involved dissolving myrrh and dragon's blood into whiskey over time, collecting blood. And for that, I just used blood from butcher, but we used consecrations from the Cambridge Book of Magic in order to consecrate the blood that was being used to develop the paint. I went with kind of a paint instead of an ink because I just have no skill at ink making, at least not yet. I'm still trying to work on learning that. And blended in some other incense components that were specific to the rite, as well as things that were part of a general incense that I use for some conjuration rituals, into that paint, as well as into the dirt in the jar itself. Pulled dirt from a few different sources that were consecrated in different ways in order to create the basis of it, so that the dirt itself would have kind of a living component that was linked to the actual space of the ritual by having the components that were used in the incense, and also linked to the actual life that was sealing the spirit into the skull by using the same blood that had been consecrated to make the paint. So everything kind of tied together in terms of the materials. The same blood paint was used for the lamens and the seals that were used in the ritual. And there were prayers over the different herbs and resins that were used. Mostly the Orphic hymns would have been used in consecrating those, and so that was a large part of the preparation leading up to it, was preparing the tools. And so when you're going through those sorts of rituals, a lot of times people focus on the preparation of fasting or abstaining from sex or alcohol or whatever, but there's a big part of it where you're beginning the ritual process as you're beginning to create the various tools and components and material that are going to be used. And I think in a lot of contemporary magic where there's not a focus on material, because a lot of the sort of European revival magic, there's a lot of tools that are used, but not really material in the sense of like material that's actually part of the working. There's something that we lose in not having to ritually engage that material and awaken the spirits in that material and involve them in the whole process of the conjuration, and then the process of interacting with those spirits as you're awakening them and putting the materials together is a process that's beginning to build the ritual for a period of weeks leading up to the actual main ritual happening. So your ritual, any given ritual you're doing, is a series of small rites that are happening, but those rites aren't necessarily confined to that 1 or 2 hour space where you're doing the ritual. Those rites can be over a period of weeks or months leading up to the ritual. And the more you have that type of engagement, I think the more intense of an experience, intense of an effect you're going to have, not just from having built up the powers involved in creating the main ritual space and main ritual moment, but how you're shaping and influencing yourself over that time leading up to it. Is a big part of it. So I don't know if anyone else had any preparations that they did. I think, Stephanie, you were the only other one that was actually an active participant in the ritual, as opposed to someone that was just attending it. You were the scryer. Do you remember having any preparation as the scryer that you did?
I don't do anything particular because my scrying just kind of happens. I don't know how to explain that. So no, mostly I was like, okay, well, I am going to try to channel and not be possessed by.
Well, then I guess in terms of sources, that was one of the other questions people asked, what sources were drawn on. So the ritual was, I think the ritual was very smoothly put together in terms of its flow and how it worked, but it drew on a lot of different materials. Again, the preparations, a lot of that came from the Cambridge Book of Magic. Um, the ritual itself used the heptameron as a base, but then it also had Orphic components. There were components connected to ancestor work in there, and those were things that are things that are part of my regular routine practice. And then there were elements where there were little bits woven in that reference and reflect the OTO's system of initiations and the EGC's processes. And so those were things where initiates and people who had undergone those sacraments would recognize them, but they might not be immediately evident to other people watching. Significant elements of it were also taken from Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, particularly elements around binding the demon to the skull were drawn from a ritual in Reginald Scott. And so it did have a large array of sources that were used in putting it together. Personally, I think it flowed well as a singular ritual. I guess the rest of you weren't involved in actually putting the ritual together, but you were all present. Does anyone have anything to say about how it flowed or how it felt, having the kind of intermingling of the OTO elements and the elements of kind of the more traditional magic systems?
Well, I mean, I was outside of the circle for the entire time because I was actually dealing with some health issues, so I couldn't actively participate with the summoning. but as somebody sitting on the outside, it was quite interesting to feel the way the energies were moving during that. It was definitely more intense than what I was used to from our normal OTO rituals. I mean, basically being just Liber 15. It had an interesting flavor. I don't know how to describe it, but I certainly enjoyed it.
And that was from being in the next room, right?
Yes, that was from being over in the next room, trying to feel better, basically.
As someone who ran the brazen head ritual out of the Grimoire of Crowley, I didn't think it would be a particular shock to anybody, but so it was different certainly than something like Liber 15, but it didn't seem like it was really all that different from what we'd done before.
I certainly felt, as also participating in the Raisin Head ritual, I felt there was some push to not necessarily fully engage with the ritual. And that wasn't from your direction, Stephanie. That was from some of the other people present who were authorities at the time.
Yeah.
And I felt like by not restricting the degree to which we engaged with the ritual, and that it was much more powerful and engaging. I mean, I was kind of told point blank by someone who was in a position of authority that the Brazen Head ritual should be a simulation. And that wasn't the way I took it or the way that I worked through it, and they were somewhat,
Or the way that it ended up going down.
yeah, and they were somewhat belittling about that aspect, I think, afterwards.
As the person who was the priestess for that ritual.
I think specifically because it made them uncomfortable. And and I got that, but I felt this was much more straightforward and potent.
I agree.
Yeah, I missed the Brazen Head ritual, and I think part of that may have been schedule, and part of it may have been that I expected that some of the powers that be were going to kind of push for it to be treated as a ritual drama and push for it to be treated as a simulation rather than an actual conjuration. And I think all of you who know me know that I have very little interest in that and don't consider that as something that anyone has time for. But I've definitely also experienced that sort of push of looking at things as just drama, or looking at things as just a ritual act that there's no deeper esoteric or occult significance or occurrence happening.
It's just kind of random for magicians to feel that way. I mean, I don't understand that push.
I would agree with you there. I will remain amused because magic works, and when we did the Brazen Head, it worked. And was
It did.
It was not just a simulation.
So
Certainly, your ritual, obviously, the summoning the familiar, obviously worked.
yeah.
And I mean, I ended up functioning as the medium for the Brazen Head ritual. I don't think that was entirely intentional. I think I was really mostly intended to be a special effects person faking things, but that isn't how it worked out once Stephanie got her hands on it and made it happen. That said, I was probably the least desirable person for that because I'm not a particularly good medium.
You weren't a bad one either.
I can function in that way when necessary, but it's not something I'm super skilled at. So
Jaren, I think this was one of the first big rituals that you attended at Blake, if I'm not mistaken. I guess, did you have any sort of takeaways or impressions from attending that?
Yeah, it was definitely very interesting to be involved as a I guess a celebrant, an observer, And I've, I had been working on developing kind of my different senses of observation within ritual, and it was really interesting to be able to focus it in an arena that I hadn't experienced before. So, for me, it was all about just opening up and gathering in as much information as I could, even though much of which that I experienced or sensed, I didn't really understand at the time. But I found it very exhilarating to be a part of.
And I think that was a big part of the goal, was kind of giving people something that was new to experience. So I think that element of it, aside from the actual magical goals, definitely worked out. So
Goal achieved.
Yeah. One of the next questions is one that I think can kind of be answered generally, not just for this ritual specifically, but for any work along these lines. But people asked about what kind of studies, skills, or practice, ceremonial or otherwise, would help prepare for this kind of work. What paths should a magician take to feel confident going into this kind of thing? And are there ordinations or initiations that help make someone ready or more capable for doing this kind of work? And I feel like this is something that can be answered kind of generally about conjuration, as well as work with familiars, but sort of any sort of work with demons or angels or beings that would be worked with through conjuration. Is there anyone who wants to kind of tackle this one first?
I have a few comments. It's really more your wheelhouse than mine.
My help insofar as talking about preparations for doing magic is more applicable to the second ritual. So
Okay.
I was not heavily involved in prepping for this ritual.
I'll just comment that I think you can read all the sources in the world, but theoretical knowledge is one thing. If you want to feel confident and prepared working with various types of beings, if you want to feel confident and prepared working with demons, work with demons. There's it's like anything else. Experience matters. And if you don't do it very often, it's going to be disorienting and disturbing. If you have some practice at it, it gets much easier because you have some experience to fall back on.
I think particularly for the sub part of the question regarding ordination and initiation, I think because I take a fairly Catholic view of grimoire work and kind of work it in that sort of Catholic context, yes, I do think that there's a benefit of having some level of ordination, and I think that's how a lot of the grimoires are intended. I think as we get to some of the later grimoires that have much more complex methods, as opposed to some of the ones that have simpler methods, that part of that is in some of the earlier Catholic grimoires, there's an expectation that you have some sort of ordination that is giving you some sort of authority. And then in later grimoires or grimoires of more Protestant extraction, there's not that expectation anymore. And so I do think that can help. In this particular ritual, I think the concept of initiation kind of comes into play too, since it was a way of aligning the familiar spirit with the lodge by connecting the ritual to points of ordination that went along with the system that the spirit would be working to help with. And I think generally it's going to depend on the types of initiations that you're doing as to whether or not they would help with this sort of work. I think you could definitely go in and like James said, just if you want to work with demons, go work with demons. You don't have to be initiated into a magical lodge to do that. And I think James really kind of summed it up for all of the preparation points. Is it's go do the work, like get your hands dirty, put your hands into what it is that you want to learn about doing, and experience it. I think the way that I was originally educated through kind of an AA structure had gave me a sense that you needed to do all this training before you worked with grimoires or before you pursued the Abermelon or did anything along those lines. And now that I've gone through all that and then done this other type of work, I'm like, no, you can jump right in with spirits, and there's ways to engage spirits where you can build up your kind of street cred in the spirit world so that you can work safely. And it's not necessarily something where you have to learn flashing colors and do top level meditations and build fire wands and things like that. It's more going through and engaging the spirits and doing the work that relates to that that's going to help prepare you.
I'll even add, I think if you're going to do those things, that doing them alongside doing some actual work makes them much more useful and effective.
I think that makes sense too. I think that there's definitely utility to some of the stuff that I will refer to sometimes as magical aerobics, like the things that help build you up and kind of develop the muscles and let you work with the training wheels. But I think doing that in a context that also addresses your end game of spirit work, or your end game of alchemy, or your end game of practical astrology, or whatever it is that you ultimately want to do, you're going to get more out of it if you're kind of working that end game system at the same time. So I guess then the next question on preparation and the ritual asked about outside of the ritual team, how were participants prepped and informed about the details, specifics of the ritual, and what kind of aftercare was given to those in attendance as well as those participating? And that's a question that I think comes up also when we talk about the demon sabbat. And so there was kind of, the two were handled a little bit differently because they were very different sort of rituals. And I guess I can kind of tackle this one initially. The actual officers of the ritual were all provided with a ritual script to review, and were told what things to have with them in terms of ritual wear and things along those lines. So not very in-depth preparation, but also the majority of the ritual officers did not read the ritual script or bring any of the things they were asked. We included all of the past masters of William Blake. So I think Stephanie and I had read the ritual and had the stuff we needed. And I think one of the past masters was like, oh, I didn't even realize that we were doing the ritual, and left. And so we had to give that past master's role to someone else. And the other ones were like, oh, crap, let me kind of look through this now. And so we had like a little bit of time to discuss it beforehand, because there was sort of a break from the rest of the day and then dinner, and people left for dinner. One of the past masters stayed with me while I was setting up. And so we got to discuss it a little bit, and then we discussed with everyone else once they were there. So there was some discussion about what would happen, and kind of a quick run through. For the rest of the participants, the main thing I think inside of the debrief beforehand was kind of explaining to everyone that this was not going to be a psychological ritual. This was not going to be a ritual that was just ritual drama. This was a ritual where we were actually going to be conjuring spirits and actually calling upon spirits to aid us in conjuring spirits, and that several spirits would be called upon, both in terms of angels and demons, as well as gods and ancestors, and that those spirits would be helping to guide and protect the ritual, but that ultimately we were going to be conjuring demons. We were going to be conjuring those demons into the space outside of the circle. And I don't think we were using a ritual triangle to bind them into a particular space. And so everyone was instructed that once we got through the preliminary things where we were making the initial offerings to the spirits that are helping us out, that it was kind of like a roller coaster. Like, keep your hands and your feet in the cart at all times. Like, if you decided you did not want to be part of the ritual, there was a point up to which you could exit. But after that point, you were in, and you needed to stay in the circle you needed to not stick things out of the circle, you needed to not try to walk out of the circle to walk out of the temple, that for your own safety, keeping your feet at that point. And we kind of made it clear where that point would be. So people understood what was coming up, what was happening. And we tried to express the sort of gravitas of that kind of work, as opposed to something where it was just kind of like, all right, well, we're going to run through the motions so you can sort of see what that would be like and kind of get some feels. It was definitely like, no, we're going to call on Big Bad and you need to stay in the circle. And I guess some of that is kind of my thinking on how much prep needs to go into something like that. I guess for other people that were present, did you feel that there were, or were there more things that we explained to people that I'm forgetting, or did you feel like we should have gone into more, or did you guys feel adequately prepared?
I mean, warnings were given clearly enough that even as somebody who was sitting outside of the ritual space in an adjacent room, there was a protective circle put up around me, and I was to stick within that during the entire time until everything was over. So I thought it was very clear and not really something to be questioned.
Yeah, I thought it was certainly adequate enough. I helped do that with Rebecca. It's always been a point of curiosity to me. She is unique in being the only person who is outside of the circle, but still within sort of the area of influence or knowledge of the ritual. Certainly there are other people in that building, and has had a somewhat personal relationship with Tobias. And, I don't think my wording sucks, but I've always wondered to some extent if there wasn't some significance to that there was a sort of different type of exposure in your case.
I mean, I certainly was very aware of things as they were going on, even though I couldn't actually really hear the ritual. I could hear a word now and then when things would be sort of said forcefully, but I wasn't close enough to really actually hear things well. But I had a sense of when those times were coming because I could actually feel shifts in the energy as things were going. It was certainly interesting. So I don't know if that actually provided some sort of link or not, but definitely a thing that I wonder about from time to time.
I think it's an interesting insight to consider. And I think we definitely had other spiritual people who rented space in the building and would come and talk to us sometimes about noticing a difference when we were having events or when we were in the building doing particular types of work. And so that was always interesting to hear. But I don't know that I ever talked to anyone in the building about that particular night, whether or not they noticed anything.
And I mean, I'd also say that sort of the issue of aftercare, preparation and aftercare for the second ritual is somewhat different in nature than aftercare for the first ritual. But in both cases, we certainly were working with a core of people who we felt were experienced magicians and were, capable of advocating for themselves if they needed aftercare.
Yeah, and I think when I lead a ritual, I tend to try to ask people about their experience afterwards, and then also for rituals like this, invite them to talk to me about their experience in the future as things kind of settle out or as they notice any effects from the ritual. And for the most part, people seem to have a very positive response after the first ritual. There wasn't anything that I recall being planned as a specific aftercare, but there also wasn't stuff where we were putting people into a situation of direct exposure or direct interaction with the spirit. Although there were some people who did have direct visionary experiences in addition to the scryer. I guess Stephanie, as the master at the time, did you feel that we had kind of appropriately explained to people what was going on and made sure people were okay afterwards?
I feel like we did. The first ritual, it was people who were informed what was going to happen, certainly had the option to leave if that was their will, until a certain point, as you pointed out. And so, and obviously we were there to talk to people afterwards if they needed that too. The second ritual, we it was a little more formal because we, because we were inviting people to interact with our spirit. So, I made sure there was, food and beverage and stuff, which is what I usually do to allow people to ground themselves and to be present if anyone needed that help.
Yeah, I mean, we've always had a tradition at William Blake, at least as long as I've really been there, mostly under Stephanie's direction, of spending time following any ritual we've done with basically sort of what we call in other environments holding space, where basically everybody sort of just relaxes together, comes down together. There's room for conversation and relating what people's experiences were, and it gives everybody sort of a chance to, in the form of as aftercare, to come down together as a group, and allows people to make the individual call for themselves when they feel that they're ready to then go back to their normal lives outside of it.
Yeah, I think that was,
Think-
sorry, go on.
I was going to say, just from my perspective as an external participant, it seemed that everybody was well prepared. Everybody seemed very confident in their role. I never once felt unsafe, and it just felt very well put together. And I think afterwards, folks were checking in with even us, and it seemed like checking in with each other. So from my perspective as the external participant in the first ritual, I was impressed.
And I'll say, I don't want to go into too much detail. Stephanie might want to say a little more. We became aware through various channels afterwards that there was somebody who left and probably needed aftercare and didn't
That's
ask
for
for
the second ritual.
yeah, for the second ritual. Well, I think we're kind of discussing both of them.
Well, we'll also have questions on the second ritual specifically, so it might make sense to talk about that later.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
So, okay, well, I guess then, in terms of the next question, when the relationship with the spirit was formed, how was it aligned to the work of the lodge? Was it aligned to the OTO in general, or was it aligned to William Blake Lodge specifically? And with it being aligned to the lodge, was it aligned specifically to that particular lodge master and the leadership of the lodge at the time? So I think we could kind of get into the specifics of how the contract worked, but I think, Stephanie, you were the one actually interacting with the demon as we negotiated the contract, and we're also the lodge master at the time. So I think it would be kind of interesting to start with how you felt with that, as far as like how it aligned to us or the OTO or to you specifically.
Well, it's a mix. I feel like because I was the scryer, I probably put a little bit more of my flavor, for lack of a better description, onto it than I perhaps meant to. But I also felt like, if we were helping William Blake Lodge, then, that would be positive for OTO. Because obviously they wouldn't want the lodge to fail. And I think I think that how the spirit itself saw things might actually be different. But I felt like, we were trying to create a positive environment for William Blake Lodge, and to make it a welcoming space. To me, that seems like it would be positive for OTO, positive for, well, people in the community in general. But your mileage may vary.
I think once the demon was acquired and sealed, that having you and I as the two people who were, well, I guess at that point conducting the two primary parts of the ritual as the conjurer and the scryer, but then also sacramentally consecrating the familiar through sort of baptism and confirmation and anointing, and kind of tying it more directly to the initiation system and the sacrament system of the OTO and the EGC. That just like when we're initiating candidates or when we are moving people through sacraments, there is a little bit of a kind of parental role and a sponsorship role, not just of on the part of the sponsors, but also on the part of the people that are performing certain elements of the ritual. And that's built into elements of certain parts of some of OTO's rituals. And so I feel like there's space that kind of connection, particularly for you and I, could have occurred with Tobias because of how he was linked to the OTO current. And that was something that did kind of occur to me at the time and afterwards. But it wasn't necessarily my goal specifically for it to be something that was tied to the specific lodge leadership at the time. But it was obviously the lodge master, the deputy master, taking the main roles and doing that, which I think made sense as far as doing something for the lodge and doing something directly for the lodge. As far as the actual contract goes, it was, I think, more specific to William Blake than it was to the OTO. Like, it was all very much about helping William Blake Lodge grow, helping William Blake Lodge get more members, helping William Blake Lodge be financially stable. Like Stephanie said, that's the sort of thing where if lodges are doing well, that's good for the OTO in general. But the actual process of the ritual definitely tied the spirit to the OTO current and the EGC currents in general, not just for Blake. So I think there's kind of multiple layers there where the ritual itself and the means of acquiring Tobias kind of connected to the OTO generally and the Thelema current generally. The actual legalistic specifics of the spirit's charge or the spirit's role were very Blake specific. But there was an element of the execution where the people that were doing the execution were the leaders at the time. And so there's probably some tie there as well, which I've kind of always wondered how that would progress over time. I guess, did anyone else have any thoughts on that, either from observation or from working with Tobias since then?
I've done a lot of direct communication with Tobias, and the sense that I have gotten from working with him is that he very much took the direction of trying to further the environment that was desired in order to make the lodge more welcoming and help it grow. It wasn't he didn't get the order of, I'm going to toe the company line of the OTO in general, but more, I'm going to push for the sort of the current of Thelema as it should be, rather than what one particular group thinks it needs to be or thinks it is.
I think that's kind of what you're signing on for when you work with a demon, is that it's going to have its view of how things should be and what it wants to create, and it's going to do the thing you ask, but it's going to do it its way.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like he definitely has an idea of what he was brought about to do and has his own opinions on how to go about doing that.
And I will,
BJ and I made our own little rebellious child.
I'll just say, if you go through the history of esotericism, when you look at spaces, they're aligned with people. I mean, nobody talks about Isis Urania as its own thing. It's a combination of the wills of Mathers and Westcott and Farr and Horniman, but those wills define it, and their struggles define it. And I think that, especially because some of the past masters that were asked to be involved really sort of abrogated those roles, and the ones that did stay involved are the ones that were probably more closely aligned with the vision that you and Stephanie had. I think that Tobias was more about that vision of what a thelemic space should look like than any specific set of words or identities, and became very closely aligned with sort of a specific vision. And that was very much what came to fruition over the next 2 years. That was very much what emerged, was a very specific vision of an idealized thelemic space that had certain traits, was a very tolerant space, was a very accepting space. So that was certainly the impression I got both then and later.
I would definitely agree with that.
Well, then I guess the last question about the first ritual was one of the EGC bishops present, because I think there was at least one, if not two. I think one of them had left. Requested an on-the-fly change to the ritual mid-ritual. Do you believe this had an impact on how Tobias was aligned to the work at hand? Now, I would say this particular bishop handled this very well. I've definitely had some interactions where some bishops have kind of decided something needed to be one way or another, and also I guess have had received things where I had to be involved in kind of discussing disputes between people where lodge masters had decided things needed to be one way or another, and in the middle of a ritual or before a ritual would kind of lay the hammer down about what they wanted or how things should be, and made things uncomfortable for the people involved, or made things where people felt like they weren't appreciated, or that there was some contention about the work in general. In this instance, it was nothing like that. The bishop involved hadn't read the ritual prior to us doing it, even though he was one of the people that was in the ritual, and he apologized for not being prepared. He noticed that we were using actual verbiage from the EGC sacraments in baptizing and confirming the Spirit, which seemed to be an important element of tying the Spirit to the work. And there are other systems that use those sorts of techniques when working with demons, moving demons through certain types of sacramental rituals that mimic the sacramental rituals that the people involved would have gone through in order to make the demon more amenable to the work at hand, or to kind of cool the demon so that it's easier to work with, or make it so that the demon is easier to call upon. And that was some of the idea that was going on there. He felt that it would be inappropriate for us to use the exact verbiage from those sacrament rituals. The sacrament rituals are public rituals and they're performed publicly. So it wasn't a matter of doing anything secret in public that shouldn't have been done, so much as, is it appropriate to take our sacraments and then give them to a demon? And so he was a little uncomfortable and asked if we would be okay with changing it mid-ritual. And we were able to do that. Basically, we dropped the verbiage that was used in the EGC sacraments and then kind of ad-libbed baptism and confirmation verbiage and went through the ritual steps without using the specific words that are used in the regular form. As to whether or not that impacted how Tobias was aligned to the work at hand, I don't think it's something I've thought about a whole lot. To me, it's always kind of stuck out more that I liked how he handled the moment, even though it was an awkward moment. And I like that we were able to kind of on the fly still move through smoothly, where I imagine people watching probably didn't realize we were changing the ritual when we changed it there. But it does make sense that it would kind of change the connection, because at that point, then Tobias's baptism and confirmation is done in a form that was essentially personal to Stephanie and I. We were the ones that were coming up with what to say in baptizing and confirming him at that point. It was no longer that he was being baptized and confirmed within the same forms that the EGC used. So even though it was under that same sort of authority and power that would be used in an EGC sacrament, the form of the sacrament was slightly different. And so I guess one would question whether or not it's the action that defines the form or if it's the words. But typically, a combination of form, intention, and authority have to be present for conferring a sacrament. And so there is some possibility that you could interpret this as having the authority and the intention, but that the form may have been changed, and so the result may be changed. I don't know if anyone else has any perspective on that. I guess most everyone in the chat is a bishop in some lineage, or if not, they are in a system where they have the ability to perform initiations. So I guess everyone has experience with things where dealing with initiations and sacraments is something that everyone here has done.
I actually wanted to comment on that. One of the feelings that I really got regarding that is that the decision and the rather adamant nature to remove the connection to the OTO sacraments actually contributed to the fact that the spirit is not particularly aligned with the order as a whole, but more took on the personal flavor of the people running the ritual.
I will definitely say that, you know, all of the words, the intent are all important. But I think if you're standing at a baptismal and one of the godparents decides, you know, that they want their lineage stricken out, that has an outsized impact if you're doing it in the middle of a ritual, probably a lot more so than if the decision had been made well beforehand. On the other hand, there's been a great deal of synchronicity around Tobias and the things that pertain to Tobias, so I'm not certain that's entirely accidental that it happened that way.
Okay. Anyone else have any feelings or thoughts surrounding that, or surrounding those sorts of impacts to changes in ritual in general?
I mean, I know that from working with the spirit, there was sort of a feeling of basically being snubbed in that regard. He was definitely not happy about the fact that people did not want to be associated with him.
I think everything that I have experienced of Tobias or have heard regarding anyone else's experiences of Tobias, that fits with his personality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's definitely the kind of spirit that wants to be liked, and I mean, he's always struck me as sort of the big brother type, the cool kid who comes home from college that everybody wants to hang out with, and like, so people gravitate toward him. And when somebody acts like he's not too thrilled about that. Not that he's vengeful about it, he just doesn't like it.
I'll even go a step further, and you know, I don't want to default to a simplistic model where belief equals power, but you know, to some extent, investment does have an influence, I think, on the objective, maybe if not the objective reality of something like Tobias, its ability to act in objective ways that affect the things around it. And I very much got the impression that, you know, when what we would call honor, what, you know, various traditions have you know, embraced as all sorts of ways in which we acknowledge the presence and existence of spirits and invest in them. That those are things which directly impact his ability to do the things he's asked to do.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. No, I think that's a good transition into kind of the more general questions about Tobias and about familiars, which I think will be what a lot of people are interested in hearing about. So the kind of first questions along those lines: what type of spirit is he? How does he differ from a servitor or a gregor? And was he created by or for the lodge, or did he already exist? I think there's a few things we can unpack in that question. I mean, I think the easy answer on what type of spirit is he's a demon. He's an infernal spirit, and he has expressed that several times when he has communicated things about his nature. But it's also something that I think is very clear, like when you're in the lodge space. There's a shrine set up for him, and there's kind of a sense, like if you walk in and you're the only one in the space, or even if there's people around and you walk over near his shrine, where it's not like it's a bad space, but there's still like a foreboding element and an edge to it. There's something where this is a space that's okay. This is a thing that's okay to interact with, but be on your guard. And he definitely presents that sense in his presence that, yeah, you can come interact with him, you can come do things, but you need to be on your guard because he has teeth. So I think as far as the rest of the question, I have my views that I can explain as far as the difference between a familiar versus a servitor and a gregor, and about him being created versus him already existing. But I think it would be good to have some other people chime in before I chime in.
I mean, for all this that he, as he likes, is swearing okay?
Yeah,
He
swearing's fine.
He's a fucking demon. He's not a demon in the sense that like the modern media likes to portray them. It means something more to be a goetic. It's not just he's this bad evil spirit, because he's not bad or evil. He's just a powerful entity that's not human, not angelic, not fae. Like they're their own thing.
And I guess that's the thing. I got a very interesting feeling after the second ritual. But I mean, we have this idea in sort of Western media culture of demons that doesn't necessarily correspond a whole lot even to how they're seen in medieval writing. But we get demons heavily through Celis, and which was translated by Ficino around the same time as he translated the Corpus Hermeticum, out of Neoplatonic classical culture. And there's a lot of different ways to look at them, but you certainly have this concept in Neoplatonic doctrine that demons are divine spirits. Plato talks about the demon of Socrates. And so I think, and in a lot of ways, when you read that writing, that's clearly the genesis of the Thelemic concept of the holy guardian angel. And I certainly think that Tobias, especially as he has been invested in, is a thing that is definitely, I mean, infernal to the extent that infernal often, it connects with those things which move and which create change. Even sometimes are erosive or destructive, but is also was or has become a thing of some significance that might be greater than what you would normally attribute in sort of Western canon to, a servitor demon or familiar demon. These things are seen typically as being very trivial and minor. And I think because he was harnessed to a very large thing, he is possibly a little bit greater than that. That's just my apprehension.
I think there's a very clear difference in dealing with servitors and egregores than dealing with pre-existing spirits. I think Jason Miller has kind of talked about the idea that when you're building a servitor, it's possible that there's some sort of local or not known spirit that's similar to what it is that you're trying to build that will kind of graft onto the servitor, and so it's not fully your own creation, but is in part something that was already pre-existing as well. I think that's a possibility. I kind of look at it in a slightly different way, where it's not fully your own creation because you're drawing on existing powers that are there, but not necessarily an existing intelligence that's there. That with the servitor, you're shaping and creating the intelligence, but you are feeding and developing the intelligence with existing powers and existing life that is present in creation. And that an egregor sort of works the same way on a larger scale, but being fed and developed by multiple people. I think when we're conjuring a demon and binding a familiar, that we're dealing with something where it's pre-existing us and is not something that's an intelligence that we're defining, but some of its interaction is going to be shaped by how we define the relationship and how we build that relationship over time. And so there is still going to be an individual component, just like there is when you develop a friendship or an interaction with another person, but they still kind of exist as who they are. Then as far as was he created by or for the lodge, or did he already exist? Like, that definitely was not an intention by us to create him. It was receiving him. We had the demon that gave him to us, provided us with a name and a seal, and we had to kind of coerce that name and seal and the agreement out of that demon. But there was an interesting moment, though, in the second ritual where Tobias described himself as having been created by Lucifer for us. And I would have probably just kind of been like, whatever, the demon is showing off and like saying crazy stuff. But there were other things that Tobias said about Lucifer and about the devil, which were struck very personal chords about things that I had not spoken about to anyone at the lodge. And so I had to kind of take a moment and pause and be like, okay, well, maybe some of what he's saying is not just him showing off, or maybe he's just showing off like, hey, I know shit that you don't expect me to know. And so there's a possibility.
Oh,
no, he's not gonna give up his secrets.
Yeah. And so he could be something that was created for the lodge, but he wasn't created by us. If he was, he's definitely from that infernal realm with the other demons and devils. I guess, did anyone else have any further thoughts on that, on his nature or anything?
I mean, I definitely get the impression from him that he certainly pre-existed.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, he wasn't something that was spawned into existence when this ritual was done. So, I mean, everything I've experienced with him definitely aligns with what you've said.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've also been there for a lot of the times that I've been channeling him. So
yeah. And what I said, I didn't want to give I may have given the impression when I talk about growing. I mean, I think everyone, whatever their nature is, grows through experience and interaction. But I don't want to give the impression. I definitely agree that Tobias was a pre-existing entity, objectively, before that ritual.
He did not want to give his name.
no, he's a stubborn little jerk sometimes.
So I guess then the question of, is he self-aware?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we need to go into that really in detail. It's pretty obvious. From everything we've said about him, it's pretty clear that he's self-aware, that he has a personality, that he is his own being. And I mean, I think a lot of us have had interactions, and generally those interactions bear out kind of similar explanations of personality. I guess, Jaren, like, if you haven't had as much to say about Tobias as kind of a specific person, but have you had like interactions where you've gotten a sense of his personality or a sense of how he thinks or does things?
Yeah, I guess for me it would be mostly senses of kind of a personality, I guess, in a way, and a sense of demanding in some ways, but also loves to have, like, praise and so on. But I have had a couple of instances, and I think I've shared with you about senses that he wants something in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you remember us talking about that.
And some visuals that he gave to me to help better understand. But I've only had just those couple of instances where I've had that from him. But I'm not one who has interacted with him as frequently as others too. So
yeah, well, I think that's a good perspective to have, though. That kind of like, obviously Rebecca has very direct interaction with him, and then I have kind of the connection from having helped establish the relationship with him. But then also I'm sort of like, oh, okay, Tobias, you do your thing. And so I think having that third perspective of someone who's there routinely, but is not necessarily as directly engaged, but still has had interaction, is kind of useful.
yeah, it was a lot like, hey, there was definitely an awareness of like what I could pick up on, and he sent me what I could pick up on, and was like, now convey this.
Yeah. So I guess that gets into then what he's capable of doing. So obviously he's able to let us know things that he wants. But what purposes does he serve for the lodge? What abilities does he have in order to serve those purposes? And then kind of an interesting follow-up there is, would he function the same way within a different order or with different members? Anyone want to start on this one?
I mean, because he's such a, I guess, well-formed personality, I very much at least get the opinion or the impression that he would behave the same if he worked for another group. But at the same time, he wouldn't be assigned to a group that didn't want the same sorts of things. Like you wouldn't call on him. He's the make friends and influence people spirit. You wouldn't call on him if you wanted, to smite down your enemies, for instance. That's not really what he does. So like I guess it's sort of, he's doing the job he's trained for. So if he's assigned to a group, then he's going to do what he does, and he's going to behave much the same for anybody that he would work with.
Yeah. One of the things that I always recall, I believe one of the principal criteria for Doulos was he gives good familiars.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, considering the context of what a good familiar means, I think that means, that's a good personnel fit. And I think that, a strong quality of good familiar is a familiar who fits in really well. And I think that Tobias was put into that role because he fits very well for it. And I mean, he definitely has a very strong streak of win friends and influence people. And create fun times. I think those are things that were very, and they play out in a lot of the sorts of things I feel like he wants and has invested interest in.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective that like he is the way he is, and so he was assigned to us because he is the way he is, rather than he is the way he is because of the way he was assigned to us. And I think kind of saying it that way kind of seems like a possible hair-splitting distinction, but I think looking at it on some of the questions of, well, did the way the ritual ran or the nature of the ritual change how he behaved or how he acted? I guess there's some element of Doulos, who's the spirit from the Book of the Offices of Spirits, who was conjured in order to provide us with Tobias, had an expectation of how things would run and what would be a good fit. And so it could be that the spirits already sort of understood how all that would go and put together a connection that was well suited to all of that already. And so, yeah, other people may have gotten something different by getting a different spirit rather than a different behavior from the same spirit.
And I do think it's also important to make the distinction that the conjuration was of Doulos, not of Tobias.
Yes.
And I mean, even down to the point where Stephanie was like, well, he was reluctant to give his name. Was he reluctant to give his name, or was Doulos still making last minute decisions on who we were going to get?
I don't feel like telling you.
That makes sense, and I certainly credit it. But I mean, it's hard to say at what point in that ritual, was it or preordained beforehand? How do these things that? At what point was it definitive that Tobias was the result we would get? And I wouldn't put it past the case that there might have been some last minute personnel changes there. Doulos was in sort of the position of deciding who to send off the bench, and who we got might have been somewhat influenced by the earlier stages of that ritual.
That's very possible. As far as what his abilities go, I think that's one of those things where if you look in a lot of the grimoires, like they'll have where demons have very specific abilities, but when you're looking at like the aerial spirits or some of those, and then even sometimes in the catalogs of demons, there'll be an element where they talk about like, yeah, they do this, they do that, they're good at this, but they can all do the same thing. Like they all can do all the stuff. They're all good at everything. And I think it's kind of difficult to say like what Tobias is capable of, because as a demon, it's like he can do all the things demons can do. But he specifically is charged to help the lodge with membership and financial elements and kind of protecting the lodge and growing the lodge and creating a space where people are comfortable. And he excels at those things. He's also able to make ceramic items explode, as he decided to show up one day. Which I still think about this frequently because it was very bizarre that we had a heat-proof ceramic dish that was used as an incense burner for him, and one day at the beginning of an event, it just sort of exploded over on his shrine, and being the main officer there, I went over to investigate it, and there was one charcoal that had been lit, but now all of the old spent charcoal pieces from previous use that were spread out throughout this dish, which, I mean, the dish had I think like a 6-inch diameter. So like these things were not anywhere close to each other. All of them were glowing bright red, as if they were all fresh, new charcoal that had all been lit right then. And it was pretty impressive and pretty off-putting to see. So he has the ability to flex when he wants to flex too. So
Yes, I believe that when that was done, there was a bit of an objection to something that had been said that was kind of controversial. And the timing of it was rather interesting.
Yeah.
But so then I guess beyond just what his abilities are and how he functions, it gets to the relationship that he has with our membership, and so people wanted to know, how is he maintained, cared and for and fed, and how does this impact work with him? So I think Rebecca and James, you guys would have the most insight into this. I mean, obviously there's the elements that we agreed in the contract with him as far as his care and maintenance, but you two are the ones who primarily were handling it. And James, over time, you've talked about some interesting insights in terms of how the care and maintenance impacts his ability to work.
Yeah, I very definitely, feel that the care and maintenance is a direct input into his efficacy. I don't think he doesn't exist or is incapable of doing things if that isn't provided. But you don't sit somebody down at a desk and expect him to do work without providing them with a computer, a stapler, all the
Lunch.
element at lunch, and some interesting the incense that was originally, so he's typically been had incense and a candle or lamp and offerings of alcohol. He seems particularly fond of whiskey, and has the sort of go-to has been Atomic Fireball, but he has also been periodically offered some better whiskeys. Angel Tears appears to be a particular favorite for ironic reasons.
That is because he is a smartass and has a sense of humor.
The thing that I found most interesting, he seems to me to have a very strong distaste for dirty cups and stuff, and very much wants the remains of his previous offerings to be taken away and out of his line of sight, as it were, before new things are presented to him. And that was very puzzling to me because typically you don't associate demons with being highly fastidious. That's something that if somebody at random in the out there in the universe were gonna, they would probably tend to associate more with angels. But he was very fastidious, and the impression I finally got from him is that effectively, the used offerings are defecation, that they're the chamber pot. They're offensive to him because they're waste, and even potentially inhibitory to him because they're waste. So he's also played games with that from time to time. We also experimented with various incense, and BJ, I'm not even sure I told you that, but towards the end of the time I was formulating incense for him, there had been a problem that wormwood, which was one of the initial components, was mildly toxic. And we had just removed it, and I had sort of sought around for a replacement for that, and eventually settled on agarwood or lignum aloes as a suitable replacement that he seemed equally happy with, that was not toxic to people. Though I believe there is still a small cache of the original wormwood incense that was causing problems for people when it was burned into space. But those are all sort of interesting observations from servicing his table, his shrine, and definitely, I felt there is a certain pride. He does not like slights, and we call slights injuries, and I think to some extent for him they are injuries. I mean, he's not corporeal. You can't hit him with a fist, so those things are injuries to him, and so necessarily I think he may take them a little more seriously than somebody would if that wasn't their primary form of interaction.
That makes a lot of sense.
Insofar as my work with care and feeding of him, one of the first things I was called to do, literally right after he had been summoned, was to make a blood offering. And for people listening, This doesn't mean that, you know, I cut a gigantic gash in myself and bled all over the place. Like, this was just literally just a couple of drops. But that became a very regular thing that he wanted, to the point where I actually had to tell him to sit and wait until I gave him the offering rather than him trying to extract it through accidents. Because it was uncanny for a while. If I forgot to give him the offering, inevitably something would happen while I was at the lodge that resulted in drawing some blood from me. And so there was a moment where we eventually had to sit and tell him if he didn't stop trying to take these offerings for himself, that he would stop getting them entirely, because taking them means that they're not offerings anymore. And that did clear up. Like, there were no more problems after that. But I think that also helped to form some of the connection and some of the ease with which I end up communicating with him at this point now. And definitely it's a thing that he has asked for on occasion when he's felt like he needed to do something that required a particular extra amount of oomph. So that's, in addition to the whiskey and the candles and the incense, that's been sort of a personal demand from him.
Well, I think that's kind of an interesting one, because if you look at the history of familiar spirits, blood is a very typical offering for them, and frequently the way it's described, at least in witch trial accounts, blood is necessary as the offering for them to perform any act. And frequently we have this image of the witch having a space where the demon suckles and just sort of draws their fill of blood. But if you look in several trial accounts, it's just a few drops that are given when the demon is doing something. And so it's very similar to this instance, where the demon wants the blood, but it doesn't need a whole lot of blood, and as long as it's getting its other offerings and getting a little bit of blood here or there, that's all it needs. But that's still something that's necessary for it to act. And I think that there's something that's interesting about that, with the way in which blood connects to life and the way that blood can be used in magic, and in particular with binding Tobias, that blood was used as a binding agent because of its relationship to life and its ability to communicate life. The skull was used because bones are something to which spirits can be bound, and skulls in particular are housing spaces for spirits. But the blood is something that's a particular bridge between the material and the sort of esoteric living force, and was sort of necessary in setting up the link to the skull, the binding to the jar, the actual feeding of the soil on which he sits, that kind of creates the living home for him. So the fact that he continues to be fed by blood makes sense for that.
It got to the point where basically all I had to do was use like a diabetic lancet, poke my finger, give him a couple drops, and that's the extent of it. And that seems to make him happy and be all that he really requires. So it was interesting, because I didn't know about what the actual requirements were historically before working with him. I had sort of the media influenced idea that when a demon wants a blood offering, they want lots and lots and lots. And the fact that I only ever felt compelled to just give a couple drops was always kind of weird to me.
I'll make another observation. I picked up some very strong impressions. He was certainly very defensive about his jar.
Yes.
But that said, I think you have this media influenced idea about this is a containing space, that the demon is something that's going to get out of the jar and do something. And clearly Tobias gets out of the jar. I mean, he does things that affect the world. And if you break it, he's not going to come out and stalk around the room. I mean, he certainly might be angry, but the impression I got is very much that because you're sealing this space that has been consecrated and dedicated, and you're sort of forming a little bubble of his space in our space that's easier for him to manifest and focus, because it's a special it's a special amount of objective space that is set aside from all other space. And in ways it functions more as a spacesuit than a prison, to use analogies. And that was just very interesting. And that it is, as you said, a home, not a prison or holding place.
Yeah, I think anchor might be a better.
Yeah, anchor is, I think, a very good.
Than a prison, because when we did the sabbat for him, the jar was actually opened and the seal was broken as part of the sabbat to give him a little bit more freedom, and then resealed as part of it to kind of rebind the connection. And one thing that I noticed with that was I think the blood offerings had kind of muddled the blood seal on the jar, which I guess to some degree there's the element of like the additional material, but it actually looked, instead of like it was just like you couldn't read it because there were other blood stains, because there really weren't. Like it's not like he's getting offering. I don't think you're actually pouring it onto the jar, but almost as if like it was chipping away and eroding because of the additional power and presence that was there, was kind of the sense that it gave. And so it was good to have the opportunity to sort of refresh that. As far as the protective of the jar thing, I think that kind of gives the opportunity to talk about a kind of interesting moment as far as Tobias's awareness and his ability to communicate. When all the drama was unfolding at Blake, there were questions about what would make sense for Tobias, and I had thought that it would make sense to possibly, if things were going to be dissolved at Blake, to just break the connection with the familiar entirely and allow him to go back to whatever business he had beforehand. And in thinking about that, I was like, well, I guess you would go and smash the jar and smash the skull to break the blood seal in order to free him from the connection. And it was like in less than a week of like debating that could be an end possibility, depending on how far south things went, where James, you brought up that Tobias was concerned about someone coming in and breaking the skull and breaking the jar, and wanted to make sure that he was being protected against that. And I think your assumption was that he thought that somebody from being brought in to like deal with things at Blake would potentially do that. And I was like, well, actually, no, I thought that would be how to kind of free him to go about his business. But I guess that's not the appropriate way to do that.
Yeah. That actually, he had communicated that particularly to me, and I had brought it to James and was like, I don't want to sound like I'm completely paranoid, but I'm getting this impression that he's really freaking out that somebody's going to try and smash his jar. I was like, can you maybe talk to somebody or do something about this, because he's really not happy about this idea.
So he was freaking out at BJ thinking about the possibility.
Yes, he was really upset and very concerned that somebody was going to come in and break his jar before he got a chance to express that no, he wanted to be instead either moved somewhere else or like anything except breaking his jar.
Yeah.
I guess that also kind of speaks to personality again, that he's picking up awareness that one of the people that was involved in kind of bringing him into his current interaction with the world was considering coming and doing violence against him, that would have been apparently very unpleasant for him. But he had the agency to then like express that no, this is definitely not something that should happen. And I thought it was just interesting that it was something where no one else was aware that I was considering that as a possible way of resolving things in the end. And then apparently Tobias was aware of it.
Yeah, like I said, he was very, very upset about that idea.
He certainly has some interesting awarenesses. I'll say there is exactly one night that having a demon in the lodge has kept me up worried and sort of like in a weird quasi nightmarish state. I just had very intrusive thoughts from him one night that weren't pleasant. That was very uncharacteristic, and that was the night that the heater caught on fire and shot tongues of flame across the room. But I happened to be awake because Tobias had kept me up until 4 something in the morning.
Yeah.
And so I saw it and was able to instantly walk over and cut it off, whereas it would have had a good probably 2 to 3 minutes to spit a stream of sparks and bits of flaming material across the room near curtains if I had not been kept awake.
That's pretty interesting. As another sort of interesting Tobias moment, today is actually the anniversary of the exploding incense dish.
I did not realize that, and I don't know the date that the heater fire occurred, and that certainly can't be blamed on him. Those were industrial heaters that were never meant for service in that capacity.
So then, I guess in terms of timing, the next question is: can he be contacted and communicated with at any time, or has he prescribed specific rules for timing contacting him? Planetary hours or the like. And I think this question kind of reflects that people tend to have a comfort looking at all spirits as falling under a planetary model, which I mean I myself have done in the past. I think Jake Strattonkamp was one of the first people to kind of point out that maybe we overdo it on assuming that all demons are planetary and that there could be entirely different models for how they're structured and how they're recorded to things. So I'm not aware of any specifics on timing that he has communicated to anyone. Has anyone else had any sort of communication like that from him?
He has never given any sort of specifics. He's always been communicative at any point that any of us wanted to reach out to him. So
He likes attention.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So then the next question: does he respond to thelemic, Solomonic, etc., or other types of frameworks in order to work for you? And when he communicates, is it mainly through a certain kind of individual perception, or does the group perceive it all at once? Do multiple members of your lodge work with him regularly? So I guess there's a couple things in there, like just sort of what models or methods are used to work with him. How does he communicate with people, and is it an individual thing, or do groups of people get the same sort of thing from him? Anyone want to tackle that?
I've certainly had direct one-on-one communications with him that haven't been openly broadcast throughout the lodge, and I have acted as an interim for people asking him questions and talking to him. I'm pretty certain that if he wants to be heard by a group, he certainly can be.
I will say that I think he's more easily heard by people that have some very specific close connection to him. Beyond that, I mean, I don't seem to have a lot of trouble communicating with him. I don't hear of, I mean, I communicate with him the way I communicate with all other spirits, which is not like I hear a voice in my head, but it's also not conversational. And I've made the comment before that as an author, characters certainly talk in my head, and that there is a distinct difference between those internal conversations and external conversations, but it's nothing I could meaningfully quantify for another person, other than to say it feels different.
Yeah, I actually tend to get more direct conversation. So I tend to actually get fully formed words and sentences from him. It's easier when I've given him like a fresh blood offering. But there are also times that he communicates through just emotions and senses of what he wants. But yeah, I've definitely actually heard his voice.
Yeah, I think the question about framework kind of gets to a point in general about familiar spirits, that if you have a familiar spirit, the idea of it being familiar to you is that it's somebody someone that you're well acquainted with, someone that's there, and so you don't necessarily need a ritual framework to deal with it, and that's generally going to be true for familiars in most cases. Now, there's points where you might do some more ritual work in order to re-cement or strengthen the relationship, or to help the familiar in a particular way, or if you need it to do something where it's going to be part of work with other spirits. But your general work with a familiar is going to be more like shrine work, where you might have a shrine set up, and so you make little offerings and leave things there, or just go talk to it. Or it may simply be a spirit that is kind of accompanying you, and so you talk to it when you need to, and it talks to you, and there's not the sort of formal thing that would exist without familiarity. So there's not really a framework that's necessary, but there's times where you would still engage in more ritual components. But I think when we've done that, it's just been things that were more along the lines of traditional magic than kind of contemporary stuff. I think in terms of do people perceive it all at once? Kind of an interesting point was when we actually did the ritual to obtain Tobias. 3 different people saw the seal at the same time, and so we had Stephanie as the actual scryer, one of the past masters, and then a member who was sort of jointly a member at our body and another local body nearby, all saw something and then came and individually communicated to me what they saw, and their descriptions essentially matched up, which I found kind of cool, because you'll get kind of the advocacies of grimoire purism, who will talk about how the only way you can have an objective experience is if you follow the grimoire to the letter, but they're still talking about seeing something in a scrying device, and still it's just the individual scryer seeing it, and they'll get something that's very visual and that they can kind of look away from and look back and still see it, but it's still just the scryer seeing it. It's still something that's a subjective experience. And it's not something where like everyone in the room is seeing it. Whereas in this ritual, we were using traditional methods, but we were combining them with some other methods, and it was definitely not set to a particular grimoire being followed to the letter. And we had 3 people all have the same vision at the same time. And further with that, while a lot of people find coercive measures with spirits to be somewhat distasteful, they are things that exist and are present because sometimes they are necessary, and sometimes they're part of working with those spirits. And so when Doulos was being obstinate about providing the name or about providing the seal for Tobias, Stephanie was not aware, but because she was seated in front of the altar where I was working and couldn't see me, I was whispering to Doulos' seal that I would expose the seal to the candle flame if he didn't comply and give the name. And so then I held the seal in front of the flame, and as the corner of the seal began to blacken and was about to light, then Stephanie revealed that he had provided a name, and so I pulled the seal away. And then when he was still reticent about providing the seal, I did the same thing. And it was at that same moment where the corner of the seal began to darken and seemed like it was about to ignite that 3 individuals all saw the seal being provided by Doulos at that time, but none of them were in a place where they could see what I was doing. So you had essentially 4 people in a joint interaction at once, with 3 of them experiencing the same result, which I've always found an interesting proof of it actually working. So I guess, did anyone else have anything to say about how he is perceived, or about members working individually or as a group, or anything along those lines?
Nothing I can think of.
Okay. Then I guess the final question on Tobias in general, as opposed to the rituals, was does he offer guidance or protection, or any signs or passes for the judgment of your order's candidates or initiates? I think this is kind of a cool question when thinking about the idea of a role that a familiar spirit would have in a lodge context. And I think if someone were to build a system of working with spirits in a lodge context where lodges had a patron spirit or a familiar spirit, then some sort of divination or work with the spirit on prospective candidates would make sense. And I think traditional Wicca does that to some degree, that there's divination done by high priestesses before candidates are initiated. But that's not something that we do in the OTO, because everyone has the right to Minerval through, I always say Minerval through 3rd degree, but I guess really Minerval through 4th PI. Has anyone else had any experience with Tobias, though, as far as that goes, where while formally we haven't done anything, like, has he provided any guidance or insight as far as people or candidates or things like that?
Yeah, he definitely has opinions about people. He has people he likes, and he has people he doesn't, and he has people that he tries to sweet talk. He doesn't always necessarily convey what's going on about it, or what's in his head about it, so to speak. But I definitely get the impression that, yeah, he doesn't exist to tell us how to think about or what sort of judgments to pass on people, but he does have his own opinions.
Okay. Well, I guess again, like, yeah, the question, well, it's kind of a cool question. It's not one that fits the context because of the nature of the OTO, but I think it's definitely one for people to think about if they were doing similar work in a different kind of context.
I can certainly say that I think he has directly and indirectly provided me with some interesting leads regarding initiations and the concept of initiation. But, again, that's nothing I could specifically let down and prove. That's just my apprehension of the matter.
So then that brings us to our final group of questions, dealing with the Demon Sabbat ritual, the kind of semi-famous, infamous ritual at this point, where we decided to celebrate Tobias's birthday by having him possess a medium and interact directly with people celebrating him. So the first question on that kind of lines up with the first question for the previous ritual questions. What preparations were used for the rituals? What materials were used, and how were they prepared? And so this one was a little different. There was kind of the preparation of the incense and the paint again, but it was a little simpler because some of those components still existed from before. There was, I think, a little hiccup on the blood, as we thought about deriving in a different way and then had to go back to the original way. But a lot of the other elements, because we were working in a different way, we weren't working in a traditional grimoire context this time. It was just a matter of acquiring things that weren't already had. And there were a lot of weird little mishaps in terms of what was available and what was not available, and kind of guiding things one way or another. And there were some things communicated by Tobias, like that some of what was being used shouldn't be the standard things we would use. Like that if we're working on a ritual celebrating a demon, then we're not going to go with a really churchy approach and have holy water and abramelin oil and things like that as what we're using to anoint and purify people. He wanted us to have colognes and perfumes and oils that were more magical, folksy oils for people to use, so that people could have scents that would be appealing to him and scents that would be sensual and that the people would enjoy, as opposed to things that were about holiness or that kind of experience. As far as the actual setup, we used flour to draw all of the circles. And so instead of like using chalk or salt, the circles were flour, partially because of the kind of particulate nature of flour, that it's something that's able to sort of be dusty and get into the air and kind of intermingle with the space in a way that's kind of liminal, but also that it's something that can be a food for the spirits and an offering for the spirits in that way, as opposed to something that's like a constraining or a binding like the salt or the chalk would be. I think those are kind of the big things that stand out in terms of material preparation for me. I guess we had most of the ritual officers from that ritual present. I guess, Rebecca, for you in particular as the medium, there'd be considerations about preparation. So did anyone else have anything that they recalled doing to prepare for the ritual or to prepare for their role in the ritual?
I mean, as the medium, mostly what I had to do to prepare, I've done or performed the medium role several times over for a variety of spirits. And what I had to be aware of ahead of time was that it was going to take a certain level of physical toll on me. Even though you wouldn't necessarily think that was going to be the case, it certainly it is taxing physically. And so I had conversations ahead of time with a couple of my partners about what things I was going to need, what things I wanted them watching for. Specifically, James was tapped at the beginning to be like my personal handler, because he didn't have a direct role in the ritual itself, so he could devote his time and attention to making sure that everything was going okay with me and that there weren't any issues on my end.
Then I guess the next question, unless anyone else had anything else on preparation, is what sources did we draw from? And for this ritual, we had elements that connected to the previous ritual. We called on all the same spirits that were called on from the original ritual. So we called on the ancestors, on Hecate, doulos. We called on one of the cardinal kings and Saint Michael, I believe, and so all the spirits that were involved in the original ritual and conjuring doulos in order to receive Tobias. But the approach was very different. We still used the conjurations and prayers that were used for them in the original ritual to some degree. But instead of being used as like commands and firm conjurations, they were used as songs that were treated as prayers and invitations for them. And so it was a little bit different in the approach, and it wasn't structured along the lines of the Heptameron or along the lines of a grimoire. It was structured more along the lines of a sabbat ritual. And so it was kind of drawing on that sort of witch's sabbat kind of approach. There were elements drawn from the Greek magical papyri and may have had some hygromantia elements drawn in there as well for facilitating the actual possession. I guess the next question really, again, kind of is a Rebecca question. What was the experience like for the possessed? And then for the rest of us, what was it like for the other people present?
Well, I mean, it was certainly very intense. I've channeled Tobias in sort of a lesser capacity prior to that during a different ceremony with a different group. And it was sort of a light possession. I was still very much aware and in complete control of the ability to just up and kick him out if I needed to. Given that this had been set up with the protective circles and with the intention of giving Tobias the ability to really actually come out and directly interact with people, that was much less the case for me this time. I was less aware, especially as the ritual went on. I have some actual like complete blackout regarding what happened and no memory of a fair chunk of the ritual because he was the one running things. It was basically like I was asleep. I know that he was kept contained within the circle, and that was part of the reason that I had handlers set up ahead of time to make sure that everything was in order, because I knew that I was going to be giving him this level of control so that he could actually directly experience the gifts that people were bringing, directly communicate much more easily with people through using my voice and body. The one thing that really struck me was just how massively powerful he was. I had never really gotten the sense before that of just what kind of strength he really had, until I agreed to just let him settle in and take over, at which point I became aware that he's a lot stronger than he had ever let on to be. So, yeah. I think insofar as the rest of the ritual, most other people are going to have to reply as to what their experiences during were. Afterward, I was a complete physical wreck. I felt like I had run roughly a marathon. I had some very typical reactions to what possession experiences are like for most mediums. I got physically sick, I was exhausted, and my handler basically made sure I was fed and watered and then wrapped up and put to bed. And the next morning, like, I felt great. It's kind of interesting how doing that, the immediate after effects were to feel very, very physically taxed, but the following day I felt fantastic. So that was an unusual thing, I guess. I would have expected to feel worse otherwise, but instead I felt, perfectly fine.
There had also been a pre-negotiation with Tobias.
Yes.
Where we discussed the fact that you had a lot of things to do the next day and could not be incapacitated or
Yes,
debilitated.
he was being allowed to do this thing, and I was agreeing to host him, but he had to also promise to take care of me.
Yeah, we had to drive to the northern edge of Maryland and set up an event that would set up on an event that runs to 1,000 people or more, and where we have a major run a major facility and provide a certain amount of infrastructure. So we had a very busy Sunday ahead of us, and
so yeah, I guess that would have been part of the preparation ahead of time, was that I hadn't thought about, because it's been several years since this happened. But there was definitely some pre-negotiation with Tobias ahead of time as to what was going to be allowed, what I was willing to give him as the medium and host for this, and expectations that I had on how he was going to treat me, ensure that nothing bad actually happened to me, that I was left, able to function and continue to meet my needs, and that this wasn't going to be some sort of massively disruptive event in my life. And I really feel like he actually held up his end of the bargain insofar as that went. One of the things that he wanted to do was enjoy some of the whiskeys that are normally sat as offerings for him to evaporate into the air. He wanted to actually be able to imbibe them. And he was told that he was not to leave me hungover or get me sick or overindulge or anything like that. And I mean, like I said, the next day I felt fine. So I think he did a great job of taking care of my physical form.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that you noted there that he was confined to the circle, because that was something that I think a lot of us didn't quite realize until we were talking about things after the ritual, because it wasn't something that was set up as an intentional thing, but basically the seals for all of the spirits were drawn on the floor as an array of different circles, all touching each other. And Tobias was given a throne and an altar on top of his seal. And so the seal was sort of a gateway for him to manifest through. But it was noticed after the fact that he never left the seal. Like, he'd come up to the edge of the seal and then always back into the circle, and he would never actually step over the line of the seal until after the possession was over. Then Rebecca actually left the space where the circle was.
I mean, I guess, and that's something I never really asked anybody else, because I never really thought about it. But as the ritual was being done and the invocations were being done, I very much had the sense of like walls being put up around me. And there was this feeling, I don't want to call it like physical barriers, but that's what it felt like. There was an encasement that I was not going to be able to move past, and he was very aware that he was not going to be able to move past. And so when I let go, I wasn't concerned that he was going to be able to walk out of it, because it was very clear to me, like I could all but see them going up. I don't know if anybody else noticed that or felt that while that was going on, but that was certainly my impression from within.
So in terms of, I guess, what other people saw or experienced, since people also asked about what other people present felt, um, Jaren, you were kind of the officer role that was set opposite my officer role, and so we were the two that were generally closest to the action there. And then Stephanie, you also had a officer role in the ritual and kind of facilitated the interaction between the people and Tobias. Did one of you want to go next about what your experience was like for that ritual?
Sure, I'd like to go next. I think one of the things that I experienced was, well, one of my roles was to, gosh, if I can remember correctly now, maintaining connection to this ancestors and like through Hecate, I think.
Yeah.
And so that really took a lot of my focus. But actually hearing Rebecca's experience and the Tobias like reaching the edge of the boundary and so on, I feel like that the maintenance of the connection with the ancestors through Hecate strengthened that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, most of the ritual, I was so focused on that, I didn't really see much of anything else going on until I think at one point when you, I think, reached out to me to say, do I want to make an offering? So that sort of pushed me out of that, out of maintaining that constant connection so much. So I don't have as much to say about the rest of it, but that's kind of the most of my experience.
And Stephanie, did you have anything?
I like Rebecca. I mean, I didn't feel constrained, obviously, by the circle, but I felt it, and I was like, okay, that's good. That's good. You know, if people freak out, at least Tobias is contained a little bit. But that's, yeah, I didn't really worry that much. I'm sorry, but I assumed I know that you were a competent ritualist. I know that Jaren is competent, so I was not worried. The only thing that concerned me was that I had actually left my offering for Tobias in the other room, and so I ended up dashing back to get it because I've got Italian cookies for Tobias, thinking he might like those. But I was a little concerned because a lot of people were giving Tobias wine, and then I was like, well, we told him to behave, so he won't let Rebecca get hurt.
They were really small glasses.
They were very tiny little plastic glasses, yes. But I worry about my friend.
Yeah.
I guess for me, being kind of the one doing sort of the conjuration and handling that part, whereas like because Jaren was sort of handling kind of the gateway and the support for the spirit presence, and I was handling kind of like the conducting the spirit presence into the space. It was overwhelming. Like Rebecca mentioned, noticing that Tobias was much more powerful than he kind of let on before, and that was very much my feeling. Like I was not expecting at all the presence that was there, and there were points where it was really interesting because when Tobias would focus on talking to an individual person, it was like Tobias's presence drew in closer and was more contained and more focused. But then when he was just kind of speaking generally or just kind of observing things that were happening, it was like the presence was just sort of unbridled through the space and kind of was like these waves of like hellfire, and like there was like a warmth and a force to it, and kind of a dizzying, nauseous feeling that it created standing so close to it. Because I mean, I don't know that I was in the circle most of the time. There were a couple points where I was, but I was definitely right at the edge of it when I wasn't. So Jaren and I were definitely standing closer than most people were. And I have a rosary that I use for a lot of spirit work that Each bead that's strung onto it was strung on with a series of prayers, and so each bead is consecrated to Mary and Saint Benedict and to my ancestors, and so it's been used in a lot of different conjurations and ancestor work and divination, and so it's something that's a fairly useful talisman in that kind of work. And it was like I had to like cling onto the crucifix on the rosary in order to steady myself, because that was just the level of presence and power that was there. And it was something where it's like Tobias isn't malevolent or evil, but it's still just the nature of the power was one where it was not one that was particularly conducive to standing in the presence of that fire and that force that he exudes. And that was something I was not expecting at all. Like I was kind of going into him was like, well, I hope this works out as far as the possession goes, and that people are able to have an experience of Tobias, and Tobias is able to experience the things that people are bringing. I was not expecting something where I was going to feel overwhelmed and rolled over by the presence of the demonic force, because I mean, I guess also like I kind of thought of Tobias as like this little demon that was there that was just kind of like our familiar in a bottle, and like he uh, did not realize just like the level of presence and power that he had. There's also, in terms of the experiences I mentioned before, like there were things that he talked about that I had not talked with other people in the lodge about, stuff that I had experienced growing up, things from personal experiences with spirits, things from dreams that I had had recurring throughout childhood and into sort of young adulthood, where Tobias mentioned things that hinted at those things or directly referenced those things. And it would kind of sometimes like say it and then sort of glance over with like a sideways glance, like almost as to indicate like, yeah, no, I'm saying something to you right now. And that was very off-putting and surprising and not what I was expecting, because it was something where I figured that the possession would still be something that was very filtered through the medium, and this wasn't at all. It was something where it was very much like, okay, no, this is legit the demon speaking. And there were things where some of the stuff that he was saying, it was like, well, that's just him saying nonsense, except then he would tie it back to something. It was like, oh shit, okay, yeah, no, that does have some meaning to it. And um I thought there was an interesting thing where he referenced something about familiars that I had received in another ritual that we had done, where I had not talked about that particular detail with anyone about the familiars. Uh, and the fact that he kind of referenced that was interesting, because I know, James, you had instances where your familiar has kind of gone between and talked with you about things on Tobias's behalf and was involved in things with this ritual for you with Tobias. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting link, that Tobias was also sort of working through and involved with these other relationships with these other familiars that people had.
I link there.
Hearing that, I feel a lot better about the fact that I was completely overwhelmed in the medium role.
Oh,
And
don't
don't
feel
really
good about it.
remember
No,
much of it.
He's very powerful. That much
Yeah.
is clear. I
It
just
was
tend
intense.
to. I have an unfortunate tendency to leap off the cliff, kind of like the fool, and so I was like, okay, we'll prove.
Yeah, it was definitely a very intense experience.
And I guess for me, like I've from childhood work to sort of like subdue my sense of sort of supernatural presences and experiences, and have gone to places where people report all sorts of haunting phenomena, and I'm like, it's just this place, nothing's happening here, it's nothing's going on. And so then to be standing there and be like, I feel like I'm being physically knocked over by this presence, was kind of a different sort of thing.
Yes, that's actually a very good description for what it was like. It was just sort of just this thing that like pushed into the area, and there was not much room for anything else.
So I guess with the intensity of those experiences, then the question that was asked earlier about the other ritual is also asked here, makes sense. How were participants outside of the ritual team prepped and informed of the details specific to the ritual, and what type of aftercare was given to those in attendance as well as those participating? I think on this one, whereas with the first ritual, it was kind of like, I feel like I definitely described it in kind of a cavalier way of like, yeah, just stay in the circle. Like, it's going to be a demon. Like, just stay in the circle. With this one, we had a lot more information that was put out beforehand. We had descriptions of what the ritual was going to be like on our lodge calendar. We had descriptions on Facebook. On Facebook, we had posts talking about like ideas for offerings people could bring and what kind of interactions could happen. We had people that asked questions beforehand about potential offerings and about how the ritual was going to go down, and we discussed with those people the answers to their questions. So I think there was not a lot of space to not be informed. I think anyone who chose to attend and did not feel informed about what was going to happen, they chose to not take the opportunities to be informed, because we had multiple venues where the information was out there beforehand, as well as discussing it at the ritual itself. We had,
Yeah, there was pre-talk ahead of time.
yeah, we do frequently at Blake, we'll do kind of a debrief before a ritual where we'll talk about what the audience participation expectations are, what things the audience should do, what things they should not, or I guess not audience, like congregation or ritual participants, what people should and should not do, what people should be prepared for, if there's information they need, if there's like things that they have to craft or names that they need to know. So it's sort of like the kind of deacon speech that's given before a mass. We tend to do that for other rituals as well, just because you can't throw a bunch of people into a ritual and expect them to know what to do if they're just attending a public ritual. And anything where people are going to be confronted with things that they're potentially not ready for, or things that are a little more extreme or different, or anything where there's going to be issues of consent or things to be consumed, or anything along those lines where people have to be able to make informed choices. Like we make sure to give that information. So all of that was done, I think, very adequately.
I would certainly agree with that.
I mean, it was a bring a gift party and everybody brought a gift. So I think people were pretty well informed as to the.
And I know we were talking very thoroughly before the ritual even started about the sorts of things that could happen, because there was like the mischief with the cologne.
Right. I was just going to say like that. We even had discussion about whether or not you wanted to continue with your participation at that point, and or if you wanted us to change out some of the items that were being used because of how they personally connected to you, and how it seemed that Tobias was sort of orchestrating that as a prank.
Yeah, I mean, he was making it very, for the people who are listening who aren't familiar with the backstory, when deciding that people were going to be anointed with some sorts of perfumes or colognes or whatever, instead of using like abramelin or hyssop, BJ, I guess you can talk about the mad quest you were sent on to find the cologne. But what ended up being brought, BJ had no knowledge of this because it goes back to my childhood, was the cologne that my father always wore. And it sort of put me in a very interesting headspace and gave me this sense of being schooled, like, hey, little girl, I'm gonna mess with you, before we even got started. So there was a lot of conversation of, well, yes, this demon likes to play jokes, he likes to pull pranks. Anybody coming into the situation, if you're not prepared to be fucked with, please don't join in on this because this demon, like he's got a sense of humor and he's got a sense of mischief, and he's gonna mess with you if you allow it.
Yeah, we did a lot of, if the demon tells you something, tells you to do something or whatever, you don't have to. It's a demon.
Yeah.
It's okay to ignore what the demon says.
Do not feel compelled to take instructions from him, because if you allow him, he's going to mess with you.
Yeah, as far as the details on purchasing the cologne, the cologne that was purchased is one that I use personally, and I also use in personal ritual work with my ancestor altar because it's what my father used as well. But specifically when I went to the store, I was like, I don't want to just bring my cologne from home that I use or my cologne that I use in ritual work. I want to get something specific for this that's different. And so I did not grab what I already had and went to the store to find something else and wanted to find a variety of things. And it was Father's Day weekend. So normally at Walmart, you would have the aisle with all the different like Father's Day gifts, and there'd be a ton of different cologne and soap packages, or just like a variety of cheap colognes in that aisle. The aisle was just destroyed. There was nothing there. So then I went into the regular like health and beauty section and tried to find cologne there. All of the perfumes and colognes were in a locked case and no one was working the section. The only thing that they had that was not locked was this one cologne. And there were colognes that were cheaper that were locked up. This was the only thing that was available on the shelf to purchase. And they had dozens of other types there, but everything was locked away and there was no one there to unlock it. So eventually it was just like, all right, well, I guess I'm getting this, even though I could have just brought this from home and didn't need to pick up something new. And did not realize that there was going to be any particular connection until it got to the lodge.
Yeah, because when I got there and saw that cologne sitting out, I immediately assumed that one of my partners who was visiting from California and was coming to participate in this ritual, I immediately assumed he was trying to fuck with me. Like I thought he had brought it as a prank and was just trying to mess with me. And when he denied knowledge and James denied knowledge, and then it came out that you had been the one that brought it, you had absolutely no idea about my personal connection with this stuff. It became clear that Tobias was already,
He was flexing.
he was already setting the mood for the way things were going to go down during this, and the sort that he was going to definitely put his personality out there, and it was going to be an experience.
Yeah, I think I was puzzled as to how it even ended up out on the table in the main room, because all the other ritual supplies were in a box that were brought back into the temple room with me. And
Yeah,
that was just sitting out in the middle of the table out of nowhere.
Yeah, I don't know how that.
It was very weird that it was just sitting there by itself.
So I guess then, as far as, but the whole discussion about that was a very public discussion in front of people. So it was something where there were lots of discussions about everything happening before anything started with the ritual. Or at least,
Yeah, there was nothing quiet or whispered about it. There was, okay, apparently he's feeling mischievous today and he's clearly ready to mess with people.
Yeah.
So then I guess Aftercare, and this is one where I think like Rebecca, James, you guys can kind of talk about the Aftercare for yourselves. But as far as the general group, I will say, like, we didn't have a lot of after stuff for this. Like, we kind of expected there was going to be a party and a celebration and there'd be people eating and drinking, and so the ritual would sort of continue into the party. But I think everyone was kind of subdued and just relaxed afterwards. Like, most people were very chill and just wanted to kind of relax and sit and chat. And
But that, again, that's always been sort of the typical aftercare for any sort of ritual at William Blake, is that people spend time talk through what they experienced, hang out with one another, communicate, and then when you're feeling like you're good to go, you make that decision and you head off on your own. That's in the kink scene, we call that holding space. And while it doesn't seem like it's significant aftercare, it really is. It's very much the way that we will do things, especially for esoteric experiences in the kink world. That's very much a standard of aftercare for the group. And then if somebody needs something more specific or individualized, like I knew I was going into it, I pre-negotiated with James and my other partner that they were going to take care of me. And so there were blankets and water and a nice soft place to put me to bed. And they sat with me and talked with me and let me come down from the experience and make sure that I was feeling okay and ready to sleep, as my own personal aftercare, but I had pre-negotiated that as an experienced medium.
And I certainly think one thing with aftercare in that regard is, you're dealing with a very experienced group of ritualists and people who are initiated in a number of traditions, and you don't want to be condescending about aftercare. That sort of negates the point and makes it a negative experience. You want to provide people with the option to have support if they need it, but you want to do that in a way that's respectful, and doesn't sort of presuppose that they're not
going to be scared by the big creepy demon.
Yeah, and so I think that's how we've sort of modeled aftercare, and I think generally that's been very successful.
I think from my own experience, the idea of that holding space, like it definitely can be useful. Like I recall when we did the I guess at that point it was that was before New Orpheum hosted. That was when it was still being hosted under Blake. When we did the Eleusinian initiation and the Dionysian ordinations and then the Dionysus ritual, I was pretty blasted from just channeling immense amount of Dionysian presence through 3 rituals at that point by the end, and not in the sense of like needing to like pass out or lay down or something, but in a sense of just being like fired up bull ready to go and run through a china shop. And if it had been like, all right, we're done, roll out, get out of here right afterwards, I probably would have been losing my mind and like gone off, tried to go be wild somewhere. And having the space to just kind of like come back down there was definitely like the thing that was needed. There wasn't more than that I would have needed in that case, but having that space provided was definitely what was good and useful there.
So I started to comment earlier, and I do think it bears commenting. We had one person who we were later informed probably should have had aftercare, or asked for aftercare, who left the space. They didn't disclose that to anyone present. They didn't disclose that to their host who was putting them up in the area for the night. They were somebody we had not expected at the ritual. They had assured Stephanie that they were fine with the content. It turned out upon some later investigation that they probably had some ulterior motives in attending that particular ritual, which made some of their interactions with Tobias, because Tobias had spoken in very strong terms that they were loved there and welcome there, and that everyone there liked them, certainly made that a little bit more mischievous than it might have appeared in initial observation. It did mean that as part of the due diligence afterwards, I checked in with every single other attendee of the ritual, including some of the people that we knew less well. It was a very small event, really. It
was in the middle of Pride weekend in Baltimore, which means a lot of people were doing Pride stuff.
Yeah. And so Everyone else had had a positive experience and had felt that things went well for them. And so, I will say that led us to think a good bit. I think some positives came out of that. We thought a lot about safety in spirit possession work, spirit transpossession work. And we actually put a paper together on that, which Rebecca and I presented at the unconference at OTO's Noticon in Cleveland in August of 2019. And that I can certainly send you the link for that if you want to include it with any of the written discussion on this.
Yeah, that'd be good. Probably also be good for me to share the paper that I wrote on spirit possession in European traditional magic in the sort of show note links for this. And I guess like there is an element of with that when there's a community and a space provided for people to decompress, and if someone chooses not to stay and be part of that, then there's only so much that you can do. Which I mean, I've seen in the case of other rituals also where people responded in interesting ways to the spiritual forces that were being dealt with, and where most people kind of stayed and enjoyed the company, enjoyed the space, and tried to kind of like ride out whatever they were riding out or come down in whatever way they need to come down, that sometimes people can't quite process that the same way, and they kind of run off and then have whatever feelings they have afterwards as a result, and that's kind of their own thing. I guess Jaren, is it okay to ask you, since you have experience with ritual work that involves spirit possession in other contexts, are there things that are typical for caring for the people that are present and experiencing someone in that state, or things that are typical for caring for the person who was in that state that the community tends to do or people do?
I think in general, what happens at Blake is more than what other areas will do. I mean, there will be a kind of a general check-in afterward. Here, drink some water. But there's not as much attention to making sure folks are okay before leaving in the same way that is done at Blake. So I mean, at Blake it seems to be above and beyond, actually. And I think that could be mainly because in other arenas there is a sense of knowing that folks are kind of competent or whatever, have experienced this before. And folks will probably speak up if they need something else. But I mean, what happened at Blake was, I think, appropriate for folks who may not have experienced that much intense energetics and spirit work, and giving that space afterward was, I think, very effective in helping folks to really, come back to themselves in a sense. Does that answer what you're asking for?
Oh, definitely, yes. And I was going to say, I think that makes sense that in an arena where that's a normal part of the spiritual interaction, a normal part of the activity, that there might be something that's less present as far as what people are expecting afterwards. Because yeah, I think it would make sense if people are used to that routinely, that they would kind of know what they need and know what to do.
And food tends to be a part of the events afterwards too, in other arenas.
Well,
but more afterward,
yeah,
which can be very grounding.
Blake has never had a shortage of food.
That is for sure.
So, and then I guess the last question, and this was one where I will admit I'm the one asking this question because I felt that it was one that needed to be answered and addressed somewhat, because I definitely felt a little self-conscious and a little put off by some of the discussion that was happening after things were posted and discussed about the ritual, and after some of the drama and controversy came out. People drew some comparisons between having a spirit in a jar with some practices that occur in African traditional religions and African diaspora religions, things like the Nganga and some other practices and some other traditions. And then after the demon sabbat, there were people who drew comparisons with African practices and African diaspora practices, and there was some debate as to whether or not that was our intention or whether or not the ritual was intended as kind of an African diaspora style ritual, and people wondered if perhaps that was why there was some backlash, that people were uncomfortable with us doing a ritual in that style. And so the question that I felt needed to be answered was whether or not either the ritual procuring the spirit or the ritual to celebrate the spirit were intended to be viewed as practices in that sort of tradition, and whether or not members of those traditions were present who could offer insights to comparison. So I guess the first part, as the person who put together both of those rituals, no, neither one was intended as an ADR ritual. I am not an initiate of any ADR tradition. Um, I have had some exposure to people who were initiates and have discussed things with them, learned things from them, talked with them about things over the years. And I have some interest, particularly in Kimbanda and Spiritismo and a few other traditions along those lines, but am not an initiate. And because I don't feel that I could adequately put the attention into practicing, even practicing, like as Jesse Hathaway refers to, practicing spiritually, where you're not an initiate, but you're working with the Eshus and Pomagiras and working with some of the techniques. I don't feel that I can, at this time, kind of commit to those relationships in the way they would need to be committed to. I've avoided somewhat diving into that. Now, having taken some classes that deal with that, having also taken classes in college that covered some things with some African diaspora religions, and read books and talked to practitioners, there's places where I am influenced by those ideas and influenced by some of those practices, much the way that those practices are influenced by ideas from European magical systems. And so yes, there are things where there was some influence there and some thinking there, where looking at the way that things are described and explained in Kimbanda and in some other traditions, and looking at how that impacts how we use certain materials and how we relate to spirits in certain ways, those were thoughts that would have been influencing me, but in the sense that those are thoughts that are always influencing my practice, that they're thoughts that are always sort of woven in and impact how I view spirits and how I interact with spirits and how I interact with certain materials, not things where these rituals were specifically intended to express those things or use those things. The idea of binding the spirit in the skull and in the jar was much more drawn from Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft, and drawn from just practices that I was familiar with in general and practices that we do see in European magic, than it was anything from an African tradition. There are definitely comparisons. There's definitely things that you could look at and you could say, oh, this is being drawn from this or this is being drawn from that, but you could make those comparisons either way. Like, for instance, the names through the spikes through the names is directly a Reginald Scott thing. It's not something where we were trying to mimic the idea of the metal spikes or daggers that would be in certain types of spirit pots in some African traditions. It was something that was, you could easily look at and say, oh, you're taking this from that, but no, it was straight out of Reginald Scott. So in terms of the second ritual, the idea was much more to have something that was like the witch's sabbat. And so there was a lot of looking at accounts of sabbats and what happens at sabbats, and which is something that I've been doing for years and studying and looking at how that plays into things, and how the witch's sabbat and elements of witchcraft are part of what we need in order to kind of return European traditional magic to the space of a living tradition that's able to develop and have the same sort of leadership that you see in other living traditions. And so this was an attempt at regaining some element of that. And so all of those things that we did with having kind of the more open space, the more open working with the spirits, the inviting the spirits, as opposed to attempting to constrain or conjure the spirits, working with the idea of the spirit being embodied in a person and people able to interact directly with the spirit through a central medium, are all things that are part of traditional European witches' sabbats. And so it was an attempt at trying to recreate that rather than an attempt at trying to mimic an ADR ritual. Now, the problem with that is obviously the technology of the witches' sabbat is not something that we have intact. It's not something where we fully have, well, this is exactly how they did these things, and this is exactly what was playing out and exactly what happened. We have trial accounts, we have folklore, we have myths and stories, but we don't have something that's passed down as this is 100% how this was done. And so we have to supplement and look at things from other sources. And so again, yes, there are some things where there's influence from things that I've learned from studying other traditions and other modes of spirit work, which include things from the African diaspora, but also from other parts of the world, as well as looking at what we do know from historical European modes of practice. And so taking all of those and putting together the pieces to try to create something that would do what it is that we understand was done in the past. So I think, yes, there were some places where you could go through and say like, oh, these are some ideas that BJ took from Kimbanda, or these are some places where having studied some Kimbanda stuff and taken some classes and looked at some things in that arena, influenced some of how the thinking that was done in putting together these things, or the approach to these materials, or the approach to these tools. But that's not the same as saying that it's an ADR ritual or an attempt at an ADR ritual, and that was never the intention. I think some people who looked at it and could see some of those similarities, and some people who knew that I have some interest in that direction, may have thought that that's where it was, and so that was where some of that idea came into play. But I think that it's important to recognize that no, we were not trying to recreate that or mimic that or appropriate or steal that, and that was not why people had questions or concerns about the ritual, that it wasn't about any similarity to that. So then the second part of the question, were members of ADRs present who could offer insight into comparison? Personally, I think it's something that would be interesting for me to hear, but also interesting for other people listening to hear. Jaron, did you have any thoughts? I'm sure you saw people make those comments or saw people make those comparisons, but having been at both rituals and having experience in that arena, were there things that you thought were similar or different, or things that looked like we were kind of pulling from that kind of work? And obviously you were someone that I wanted involved in the second ritual because you had that background and you had experience with those modes of working that we were trying to accomplish through this ritual. What are sort of your thoughts or insights on that?
Never at any time did I think that it was trying to utilize anything from an ATR ADR practice. To me, they're very different. The commonality would be possession, and that's it, really. Most of the traditions I've witnessed that that try to bring on possession involve drum and song. We didn't do that. You know, there may be some drawing of sigils and things on the ground, but they're very different from the things that we were drawing on the floor. You know, they're, and I think also different purposes for drawing them too. But at least within the venue of song and drum, song, and dance, is that there is someone who is intimately aware of the languaging of the songs and skilled enough to know when someone is being touched, and then they switch their wording around to induce the possession. But we didn't have any of that. We drew upon the specifics of more European and Solomonic-based experiences to bring upon, the result. So to me, it's night and day. There are no comparisons other than, maybe the end result. And I think that it's great that you're inspired by some of these traditions, but I never saw anything that to me resembled an ATR or ADR practice.
I think that's a good kind of element of looking at inspiration versus appropriation. It's like we can take things where we look at how things are done in another system. We can take things where we look at how they understand particular bits of spiritual or ritual technology, and that can inform how we think about things, and it can inform like choices we make. But when we're making those choices and doing those things, it's still going to look like the systems that we're part of. It's not going to look like a parody or an aping or a copy of something else.
Right.
I agree, and I want to say I may have added some fuel to that. I was, for various reasons, which I don't think are important to go into, called on to do some written defense of this ritual in certain contexts, and on a couple of occasions, comments that I made were more widely published. And I did talk about, I discussed, I think that there was pushback from some people regarding the ritual because they have biases and prejudices about things that look to them like ADR. And I think that was part of the reason that they had negative feelings, and I addressed that. And if I gave the impression that was saying that I felt the ritual was in fact structured that way, that's a somewhat of a misstatement. But I in trying to handle one front, I may have inadvertently caused some problems on another. I will say that I think there's sort of an underlying similarity of feeling, because often the magic that is presented as European is very stiff and very wooden and mostly theoretical. And we were doing practical and celebratory magic. And I think because, as BJ, there's a lot of cultural influences back and forth between these various traditions. And there are certainly ADR influences on how East Coastal Americans practice European style magic going back to the 1980s. I think that when you are doing practical and celebratory magic, that's not something that people instantly equate with the European tradition, even though it probably is, you talked about with witches, sabbat should be, and that is a thing that's very much been missing in those traditions. And I think that when you start putting it back in, there are people who are not necessarily happy about that.
Yeah, I'd like to say too that ADRs do not hold the monopoly on spirit possession. And from the perspective of folks who might have only that experience, it might seem like that.
Yeah.
But also if folks don't even really know, and from a more European perspective, have a fear of being perceived as trying to appropriate, there could be a lot of folks who speak from that perspective too, and they tend to do that without asking directly, so I think it's good that this question was developed and that we're addressing it now. But it's unfortunate people didn't ask directly. And when I've seen comments, I've tried to at least speak to it, but I don't always have the time, or don't always see them either. But I'm pretty open if folks want to reach out and say, what do you think of this? Because I have an opinion and I'll say it. You know, I tend not to be very inflammatory usually, but I will say, you know, I will say my opinion from my own perspective.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, to me, it did not impinge at all upon ADR's ATR.
I think that the you bring up a good point in general about advocacy, that people will often advocate for something that they have no connection to, and they don't ask the actual people. And that's something I see frequently as a person of color, that there's a lot of things that people advocate where it's like, whoa, 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 wait, no, that's, why are you advocating that? But I think to James's point about kind of the concern that people might look at this and see something and think like, whoa, that's something that's not us, it's something that's foreign, that kind of looking at, again, since Kimbanda is the ADR tradition that probably has informed my thinking the most, is one of the traditions referred to sometimes as Makumba, and that's kind of a dismissive word frequently. It's like, oh, that's that magic, like the really black, like African people, and like, no, that's not the educated magic. That I think in a European perspective, that looking at historical witchcraft sometimes has that same kind of dismissive view, like, because it's not the stilted, formalized, educated magic that is associated with grimoires, or associated with lodges, or associated with kind of the fin de siècle magical theorists, or the magical revival theorists. And even though that cunning folk who kind of straddled the line between those two approaches definitely were using books and educating their magic, and that there were definitely people that were accused of or tried for witchcraft who had access to magical books and were educated, that there's still a perception that it's like, oh, that's that low, dirty folk magic that peasants did, who didn't have their teeth and didn't know what they were doing and were just like possessed by spirits and ill-informed. And so excuse me, I think it's something where the same sort of dismissive view can kind of occur with both types of practices, if you have the sort of people who would want to dismiss those practices. So I can see where that kind of perspective of this is what people are seeing and this is what people are reacting to could kind of come into play there.
One of the things I go to is Liberal, chapter 1, verse 37. Also the mantras and spells, the obeah and the wanga, the work of the wand and the work of the sword, these he shall learn and teach. Obeah and wanga are direct references to African diasporic practices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's in the book of the law. And to me, it speaks to, you know, the world is there for us to explore magically. And if it speaks to you in a way that you should be engaging in, then do it. And there are folks who don't, if it doesn't speak to them, well, then they should reserve their judgment on those who do practice.
Mm-hmm.
And for lack of a more appropriate term, shove it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that you bring up that line again is interesting, because at least Nikolai Friesvold's descriptions of obeah, they very much, to me, feel similar to a lot of things that you would see in historical European witchcraft. I don't even want to say traditional witchcraft, because traditional witchcraft is still kind of modern in a sense, and influenced by Cochrane and a series of other writers. But looking at a lot of historical witchcraft things, there's things that are similar there, and kind of put them into the sort of space where, yeah, they would have the same sort of view in society. And looking at some early Jamaican colonial writings about Obia, there's definitely that kind of dismissive, like, oh yeah, these are some guys like catching bugs and snakes and putting them in sacks and hanging them in fields. They're doing crazy weird stuff, and it's like there's
And the other side of that being effective magic.
yes. And like there's a lot of effective stuff there, and a lot of deeper stuff there that's going on than what people who are trying to dismiss it say. And I think both those systems and sort of the similar European systems get that same sort of dismissal.
Yeah.
And can inform each other in interesting ways.
Yeah. I want to bring up one more thing too. You had mentioned at one point Espiritismo. And within Espiritismo, we don't have drum and dance associated with trying to bring on possession. And in fact, we don't necessarily always try to bring on possession. It's mainly to at least commune with spirits, and messages come through without possession. But on occasion, possession does happen too. But we get folks into that space, into that mindset, that altered space through prayer and song on occasion, but mostly prayer. And then if a spirit has a connection with the person, then they can come often and possess the person to bring about messages and so on. So again, it's different from what we did at the second ritual, at the Demon Sabbat.
Yeah, I would say as far as rituals that we did at Blake, when we did the Feast for the Ancestors, that was one where I was very open about the fact that I was drawing on ideas from Kimbanda and Espiritismo, and that we were using things that were influenced by that, and that I presented the ritual to people engaged in some of those traditions, and was like, here, this is how I explained the influence, and how I explained that this is not those traditions, but this is what we did. And it was kind of got sort of the response of like, yeah, no, I can see where the influence is there, but yeah, you handle it in a way where it's very clear that it's its own thing. It's not these traditions, even if these traditions are influencing. And I think that this was definitely not one where it was like, all right, this is how we're showcasing and highlighting like how we can kind of borrow these ideas. It was much more like, no, we're trying to revive European witchcraft with this.
Yeah.
Okay, so that, I think, wraps up all of our questions. Did anyone else have any insights or thoughts they wanted to share before we kind of wrap up?
Nothing particularly for me. I mean, I think we covered it pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of stuff. You're at a little
A
of
lot of stuff.
well, hopefully people enjoy it, and thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts and your insights and experiences.
I will say that if there are plans to do any similar rituals in the near future, reach out to me. I'd love to participate.
Be awesome. Love to involve you with that.